Hi there, folks. I'm Dara Star Tucker, and this is The Breakdown. It's so good to be back with you for another episode of the show here on KJLH, where we settle in, we narrow our focus, and we talk about the issues that matter. Just a reminder to follow KJLH on Instagram. Instagram is a very good place to find supplemental information on all of the things that are going on here at the station and in the city of Los Angeles in general. I did a brief check-in from the floor of the Democratic National Convention a couple of weeks ago, for instance, and that went up on the station's Instagram page. So I would highly recommend following the station over there on Instagram at Radio Free KJLH. I also have a personal Instagram page. It's Dara Tucker B. And on all other platforms, you can find me at Dara Star Tucker. That's Dara with one R and Star with two. I'm constantly posting my ruminations on all sorts of topics that impact all of our lives, issues that I care about like racial justice, reproductive rights, climate justice, criminal justice reform. I keep a steady log of my thoughts on a wide variety of topics over there, so I would encourage you to plug in if you have not done that yet. Now, this week on The Breakdown, I actually want to talk to you about one of the recent videos that I posted on my socials around the topic of race specifically as it pertains to Kamala Harris and a lot of the unserious accusations that are coming from Trump around that issue. And I'll give you sort of a window into my thought process around a lot of the content that I'm creating both in this political season and beyond. My producer, Van Everett, gave me a really important reminder recently. Ask yourself, he said, ask yourself what you want your audience to take away from your content. And this is a rule that I've carried with me throughout my time making content online around all of the topics that I discuss. It's not just enough to stir the pot or put out sensational reactions to all kinds of incendiary topics that you know are going to get a rise out of your viewers and listeners. I really try to avoid engaging in what's known as rage farming or rage baiting. There's no real value in that for me or for anyone else. You can get a lot of clicks and views and likes and a lot of interaction, and you may actually gain widespread acclaim for that. We see a lot of that online, but it's always my hope that the messaging that I put out there serves a greater purpose than just giving people something to be upset about. The issues that I talk about on here, on this show, are deeply personal to me, and I know that they are to a lot of you. We actually want to see change come about in these areas, and I often contemplate what my role is in all of that. So for that reason, I really try to avoid taking the bait, particularly with someone like Donald Trump, who is a professional, you-know-what stirrer. He's an agent of chaos. He is very good at setting off Roman candles and bottle rockets and sparklers and doing whatever he has to do to create a diversion from the fact that he does not have the slightest clue what he is actually doing. He is a master of that, and I think a lot of folks have recognized that from the very beginning, but it doesn't mean that the cable news networks won't play into it because it brings ratings for them. I've always tried to avoid that kind of approach with Trump. I think it's important to bring attention to the reality of who he is and the harm that he poses, but I think we can do that without falling for his tactics and giving him exactly what he wants, which is just more attention. And we all knew what Kamala Harris would be walking into having to run against someone like him. We knew that this would not be a straightforward campaign. We knew that it would get ugly very quickly. And I think he's met those expectations. And if we all know him, he is getting ready to exceed those expectations. So we've seen attacks so far on Kamala Harris's race, on her gender, on her overall fitness for the job when she's running against someone who never held public office before he ran for the office of the President of the United States. He was a businessman before he entered politics, and he really did not know a whole lot about how the system worked at all. He wants to run this country like one of his companies, which he's run into the ground multiple times. I don't necessarily want to adjudicate all of that here, but I think it's just an indication of how prevalent racism and sexism are, that Kamala Harris's qualifications are being questioned when she's been a district attorney, an attorney general, a senator, and a vice president. And someone like Donald Trump, as unqualified a president as we've ever had, has the gall to question whether or not she is qualified or intelligent enough to be president. But as I said, I think it's a bit of a trap to fall prey to the need to offer rebuttals for every unfounded accusation that he throws out there. I actually love Kamala's approach, which we saw her use with Dana Bash on CNN, which was simply to say, same old tactics, next question, which is really as deep as her responses should probably be. But I think a lot of the commentary that we've seen around this issue of her race, how black is she? Is she black enough? Has led to a larger conversation that maybe is worth exploring on some level. And just to be clear, I don't think Donald Trump is really capable of contemplating any of these questions deeply. That is not the point of him bringing up her race at all. We know that that's just a distraction coming from him. But the deeper question for us as Americans are absolutely worth exploring as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going to play a brief clip for you from a conservative online commentator who calls himself older millennial. And I really hesitate to give any gas at all to people like this, but he is fairly emblematic of how a lot of conservative white folks approach this issue. I'm going to play for you a short clip from him, his recent video on this, and then I'll be back to give you my thoughts on it.
And we traced the genealogy of her father, Donald J. Harris. That runs to Ireland. We find her ancestor, Hamilton Brown. Now, contrary to the fact that his last name was Brown, he was white as He was a white Irish slave owner born, oddly enough, in 1776. Now, when Brown became an adult, he emigrated to Jamaica, which at the time was a British colony. And it was there in Jamaica where Hamilton Brown became one of the most prolific slave owners in the New World. In fact, in 1832, he actively fought against the abolition of slavery across the British Empire. But if we look at Harris's father and we just step back his heritage slowly, we don't find black people. We just find white slave owner after white slave owner after white slave owner. Kamala Harris's great-grandmother was a woman named Christina Brown, who owes her lands and houses to the money made by Hamilton Brown from slavery. But then Donald Harris's maternal grandmother is even funnier. Her name is Iris Finnegan, a real Jamaican name you got there, but her father is a lot more Irish than he is black. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't mean she doesn't get to claim being black. I'm just saying that if she claimed to be Irish, she'd be a lot more correct than when she claims to be black. Her recent heritage might be from Jamaica. The vast majority of that heritage in Jamaica is white Irish slave owners. So look, I don't get to make a determination of whether or not she's black, but honestly, she should be celebrating St. Patty's Day a lot harder than Juneteenth.
Honestly, when I watch videos like that, it makes my blood boil. I feel violence rising up in my spirit. And I hate to say that, but I am overcome with indignation because people like him and his ancestors are the ones that came up with the one-drop rule in the first place. They are the ones that made the whole concept of blackness an all or nothing at all proposition. This is all construct, but they made the rules for those constructs. And then they want to switch them up when it suits them. They did the same thing with Barack Obama. Well, why are you calling him a black president? Doesn't his white half matter? His white half has not mattered in terms of how his racial designation functions because you have insisted for hundreds of years that it not matter. But now, when it's convenient for you, you want to bring it up as a smear to create some sort of division or separation between them, people of mixed race, and the black community. Because it suits their goals. It suits their narrative. The idea of black people across the diaspora feeling any sort of solidarity with one another is inconvenient for them. It's all just so craven and so contrived that it's just sickening, frankly. And that someone like this would put this sort of commentary out there without any sort of self-awareness at all is just baffling. This content creator, he calls himself the older millennial, he is constantly getting dunked on by much smarter people. Yet he continues to put these trash takes out there because people will follow and they will watch because he's telling them what they want to hear. But I want to play for you now a video that I did in response to this conversation, which I think does explore some questions around this whole issue, not only of Kamala Harris and race, but how race functions in the Americas in a general sense. I'll play that for you now, and then I'll be right back.
I did a bit of a deep dive on Kamala Harris's genealogy after watching this dumpster fire of a video.
I actually love that this conversation is happening. I love that it's happening because I feel like there is a group of white people, and I'm speaking about the video that Yuval is stitching. There's a group of white people that have really never been forced to reckon with Black identity and with white America's impact on Black identity, racial identity. And it's so interesting when this ridiculous conversation around whether Kamala Harris is really Black and is she Black enough and all of this stuff, when this conversation first started to come to the fore because of some really ridiculous, insensitive comments that Trump made, I did a video about this and I pointed out the fact that Kamala Harris and most Black people in the Americas would have some element of European ancestry because of sexual violence. A fact that I assumed that we all knew and took for granted. But I don't think a lot of white people have really taken the time to meditate on that. And I'm not just talking about old racist white people. I'm talking about white people in general. I don't think it really occurs to them. And it's so interesting that so many white people, I mean, they love to break down their racial and ethnic heritage into tenths and quarters. And I'm a quarter Irish and a quarter Spanish. And then my great grandmother was from France and all. Black people don't really have those kinds of narratives and those kinds of experiences with their cultures of origin. We don't have that. We were cut off from that a long time ago. First of all, a lot of our ancestors came here as early as the Mayflower. Okay, so we wouldn't necessarily have a very deep connection to exactly where we come from. But then really it's only been in the age of genealogy testing or actual genetic testing that we would have been able to determine all of the different things that make up our racial or ethnic identity. We wouldn't have even known until recently to go back and say, well, I'm a quarter this or a tenth that. And those questions really aren't asked because of the history that we know exists in this country, at least, around the one drop rule and around slavery and all of that. It really was not a question. It really has not been a question in most white folks' minds what our genetic makeup even is. This is not a conversation that typically happens with white people. And I know this because I know a lot of white people. And they are not having these conversations about us. Now, the furthest I would say that this goes in our community, amongst Black folks, is we do have a lot of exoticism around the idea of having Native ancestry. We would much rather claim, a lot of Black folks would much rather claim Native ancestry than to say that any part of them is from Europe for obvious reasons. And so we're having to deal with a lot of that stuff internally, at least, now that 23andMe and Ancestry.com are kind of revealing the truth to us about where we come from genetically. So this is a conversation that is kind of new. And it's a conversation that white people very much need to be brought into because a lot of them, young and old, have never really been forced to grapple with the identities that Black people possess in terms of their genetic makeup. And it's just kind of funny to observe how historically genetics can be used to manipulate certain realities where white folks are concerned. If there is a conversation around race or racism or, who's responsible for slavery and all this stuff, they can immediately go to the history and say, well, I didn't have any ancestors who were here during slavery. Or they can say, well, my grandfather was Creek. And so, can you really call me white? It often is used as a shield on their parts while never really acknowledging that Black people, I would say 99% of us in the Americas, possess mixed ancestry. But it doesn't matter where we're concerned. It doesn't matter where we're concerned. But for a lot of white folks, it very much matters where they're concerned. So am I glad that Kamala Harris's racial identity is being made a front burner issue by people who historically would have very much adhered to the one drop rule? No, that is not a relevant conversation in terms of her fitness for the office of president. Not at all. Am I glad that some of those same people are now having to confront the history of sexual violence by their ancestors? Yeah, I am. And those same people are having to also confront the absurdity of race and what that means to us. I mean, pretending not to understand what it means to come from mixed racial heritage. She's not Black enough to say that she is the first Black female nominee of a major party, but then also all of these white ancestors that this dude is referring to. I mean, what does that all mean in the grand scheme of things? She had ancestors that were Irish slaveholders. Okay, so now what? You gonna stop treating her like a Black woman? No, I don't think you are, actually. It's a point I'm sure will be lost on most of them, but I hope that maybe it just creates a little bit of a wrinkle in their brain that just won't leave them alone, and that maybe causes them to contemplate race just a little more deeply. So, as I said, I think a lot of folks who like to engage in the exercise of poking the bear around the issue of race only want to do so when the conversation benefits them. Because, as you heard, this man was able to acknowledge that there were slaveholders in her past, but not once did you hear him bring up the idea that Blackness as a construct has always been used against Black people since the transatlantic slave trade began. I like the way I heard someone put it in my comments section. They said this is really a ploy by a white man specifically to continue to try to control the narrative around what Blackness is and what it means. And I think it absolutely burns some of them up that Black folks in general would have any sense of ownership of their own racial identity or cultural identity. And that's not a conversation that white folks are able to control in 2024. But it doesn't mean that they're not going to try. Now, I will say in a general sense that it's very interesting to hear the concept of race even being brought up by this particular group of folks at all. Obviously, we remember the comments that Trump made about Kamala Harris supposedly turning Black when she entered into politics, which is absolutely absurd. But there's a dynamic here that I really find interesting, and that is that Trump fancies himself a bit of a Ronald Reagan figure. If you watch how he moves and even listen to a lot of the verbiage that has dominated his campaigns, he's cast himself in the image of Reagan. He really had no use for the Bushes because he didn't see them as strong leaders, but he loves him some Reagan, clearly. He even stole his campaign slogan.
Only one man has the proven experience we need. Ronald Reagan for president. Let's make America great again.
Thanks to the economic policies of the Democratic Party, millions of Americans find themselves out of work. Millions more have never even had a fair chance to learn new skills, hold a decent job, or secure for themselves and their families. For those without job opportunities, we'll stimulate new opportunities, particularly in the inner cities where they live. For those who've abandoned hope, we'll restore hope and we'll welcome them into a great national crusade to make America great again.
But the dynamic here that I find really interesting is the way that Reagan dealt with race versus how Trump has chosen to deal with the issue. And those approaches are quite different when you really take a look at them. Now, Reagan famously launched his 1980 campaign in a city called Philadelphia, Mississippi. And if you're at all knowledgeable about civil rights history, then you may recognize that town as the place where 3 civil rights leaders were killed in what was known as Freedom Summer. That's the summer where a group of activists were engaging in voter registration efforts, and they were bussed down to Mississippi to help register Black voters who had been historically suppressed in that state. The voter suppression efforts in Mississippi were notorious, and they had gone completely unchecked for decades. But these activists at the height of the civil rights movement came down to Philadelphia, Mississippi to register voters. There were 2 white Jewish activists and 1 Black activist, and the 3 of them ended up being killed by the KKK. Now, if you know anything about political campaigns, you know that it was not by happenstance that Reagan chose to launch his presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi. When people launch presidential campaigns, those sites are chosen for very specific reasons. For instance, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz's first big rally was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania is thought to be probably the most important battleground state in this election. That's them making a statement about who they are most concerned about reaching out to. And Reagan was making the same statement back in 1980. He cared about reaching out to the white folks in the South who had felt disenfranchised by the civil rights movement. Ronald Reagan himself was a former Democrat. And a lot of those disaffected Southern Democrats, they were called Dixiecrats, ended up switching their party allegiance to the Republican Party in the 1960s and 70s when the Democratic Party started to embrace the civil rights movement. There goes the neighborhood, right? So when someone tells you that there was no party switch and the Republicans of today are the same as the Republicans of Lincoln's era who fought to abolish slavery, you can point to the civil rights era as one of the primary shifts that happened within that party. In addition to the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt started introducing all of the social services that he did, and he really made the Democratic Party much more amenable to workers' rights. But those 2 movements really represented a sea change within the Republican and Democratic parties. And Ronald Reagan knew that. he was making a concerted effort to reach out to working class and Southern white voters. He made a big push in that speech in Neshoba County about emphasizing states' rights. And again, if you know anything about civil rights history, you know that that term, states' rights, is a pretty consistent dog whistle for maintaining white supremacy. That is essentially the only way that that term, states' rights, has ever been used. So he knew who he was talking to. And many of you may be old enough to remember that Ronald Reagan ran an unsuccessful presidential campaign in 1976 against Jimmy Carter. And during that time, he repeated what's become an infamous anecdote about a notorious welfare queen named Linda Taylor. The whole concept of a welfare queen came from those speeches that Reagan made in the mid-70s. And a lot of that was aimed at churning up resentment and vitriol towards Black women specifically, who supposedly had multiple babies by multiple men so that they could enrich themselves by taking advantage of all the welfare programs that were available to them at the time. They were portrayed as lazy and slovenly, and they embodied the very antithesis of what this great country was all about. Again, he was playing into racist tropes and ginning up acrimony between Black and white folks because he knew that it would engender support for him and his campaign. And just the hypocrisy of this being a central campaign strategy for the party that claims that Black folks love to make everything about race. Again, these racial narratives are brought up only when it suits this group of people. And if they can't use these racial narratives to divide and conquer, then the idea of bringing up race is, oh, that's out of bounds. We don't talk about that. We don't want to live in the past. Same tactics that are being used today. But it was pretty clear that Reagan had absolutely no intention of conducting any sort of reach out to the Black community. That was not his bag. He was going to let white, Southern, and working class people know that he had their backs. And then he was going to institute all kinds of punitive and destructive policies that adversely affected poor Black communities without considering any historical context or providing any sort of framework for those poor Black communities to improve their lives on any large scale. The war on drugs being his primary transgression. I'm hoping to do a full-scale breakdown on that topic really soon. And let's not forget that even before that, all the way back in 1971, in tapes that had previously been edited, Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon were heard maligning the Tanzanian delegation to the UN for celebrating the fact that Taiwan had been expelled from the UN and communist China had been seated.
Over the one of those African countries. Yeah, they're still uncomfortable wearing it.
So Ronald Reagan was no friend to Black people, but I think Trump wants at least to create the perception that he is. And who knows why that is? I mean, obviously, Black folks have been a pretty reliable voting bloc for the Democratic Party since the civil rights movement happened. I think that's really baffling to a lot of Republicans, though I don't know why it should be. But I think his determination to sort of infiltrate that sense of loyalty that Black people feel for the Democratic Party may have a bit to do with the whole impetus for him running in the first place, which really was Barack Obama. In my estimation, Trump's hyper-focus on being able to pull particularly Black men away from the Democrats feels like a very targeted effort to enact retribution against Obama, who he hated and who made a fool of him at the White House Correspondents' Dinner all the way back in 2011.
Donald Trump is here tonight. But obviously, we all know about your credentials and breadth of experience. For example, no, seriously, just recently, in an episode of Celebrity Apprentice, at the steakhouse, the men's cooking team did not impress the judges from Omaha Steaks. And there was a lot of blame to go around, but you, Mr. Trump, recognized that the real problem was a lack of leadership. And so ultimately you didn't blame Little John or Meatloaf. You fired Gary Busey. And these are the kind of decisions that would keep me up at night.
Which a lot of people say was really the moment when Trump decided to get serious about his bid for the presidency. And we know how he ended up hounding Obama about his birth certificate, even before Trump threw his hat in the race for president. I think he knew that he couldn't beat Obama, which is why he didn't run in 2012. But that was really when Trump switched his loyalty from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party and became the Trump that we know today when Barack Obama came into office. And so you've seen a really hyper-directed outreach, if we can call it that, to the Black community ever since then. He loves to portray himself as a friend to Black people, even when making ham-fisted, insensitive statements like this.
Look how much African American communities have suffered under Democratic control. To those I say the following: what do you have to lose by trying something new like Trump? What do you have to lose? I say it again, what do you have to lose? Look, what do you have to lose? You're living in poverty, your schools are no good, you have no jobs, 58% of your youth is unemployed. What the hell do you have to lose?
So I think there's always been a rivalry in his own mind between him and Barack Obama, and he wants to basically walk up into Barack Obama's house and take his stuff. That's just my feeling about where this guy is coming from. This is the reason that he keeps pretending as though he cares about Black people at all. It's the reason that he went to the National Association of Black Journalists and made those utterly ridiculous remarks about Kamala Harris's race, about her supposedly just becoming Black when she entered political life. In his mind, I'm sure he felt like he was walking into the lion's den and taming the lions, and maybe he even felt like he was going in to charm the pants off of everybody and win a few votes in the meantime. In his own words, what do we have to lose? I'm still a little miffed at the idea that these people would even invite this man to come and spew his uninformed ramblings, to be honest. I'm sure that they felt that they were performing their journalistic duties, but I think any legitimate journalistic organization has to be fully aware of when they're simply platforming a showboater. Because the reality is that he didn't have anything to lose by going and talking to the National Association of Black Journalists. Black people who support Donald Trump have done so even while watching David Duke, the head of the KKK, endorse him, while watching him invite the white supremacist Nick Fuentes to Mar-a-Lago and having dinner with him, even while hiring people like Stephen Miller, who carries very obvious white supremacist ideals. Black Trump voters have supported him while listening to him rant about immigrants supposedly invading our country to take Black jobs, whatever those are. They've supported him while hearing him call South Carolina Congressman Byron Donalds one of the good ones.
Byron Donalds, Florida. Wow, that's nice to have you here. That's good. He's great. He's great. He knows exactly what I'm talking about. That one is smart. You have smart ones and you have some that aren't quite so good.
They've supported him while listening to him claim that his felony convictions would make him more relatable to them. They've supported him while listening to him claim that there were very good people on both sides of the Charlottesville protests that killed a young woman who was fighting white supremacists. And as my mutual Joshua Doss has pointed out, they've supported him while listening to revered civil rights leaders like John Lewis tell them in no uncertain terms that Trump is a racist.
And it's a shame and a disgrace that the President of the United States of America, he's preaching the seed and sowing the seed of racism.
So why does Trump care so much about winning over Black people? In my estimation, he's hashing out a vendetta against Barack Obama, and as usual, he is making a fool of himself while doing so. I would honestly rather that he just ignore us. Just keep my name out of your mouth. If you can't do a little bit better than what you've been doing, keep our names out of your mouth. But he's going to keep trying. And the polling would actually show that it is working to a degree. Polling earlier this year showed that up to 35% of Black voters did not plan to vote Democratic, whether that meant that they liked a third-party candidate like Robert Kennedy or Cornel West. But Joe Biden was only garnering the support of about 65% of the Black people who were polled at that time. His support among the Black community had fallen way off from what it was in 2020, which was 82% to Donald Trump's 4%. And this is from polling out of Suffolk University. So earlier this year, Biden was at 65% with Black voters, and Trump plus third-party candidates were at 35%. Now, that Suffolk University poll taken in late August of 2024, very recently, shows that Kamala Harris stopped the bloodletting and has brought back a lot of Black voters into the fold. She has the support of 76% of Black voters versus Trump's 12%. But considering that 92% of Black voters favored Hillary Clinton over Trump back in 2016, it's very clear that he's made a lot of inroads in the Black community, and he's won a lot of support despite all of those factors that I mentioned earlier. And a lot of that support has come from Black men specifically. There's a significant gender gap among Black supporters between Harris and Trump. According to a Pew Research study, about 10% of Black women say that they are leaning towards voting for Trump, while 16% of Black men say that they're leaning towards Trump. And depending on voter turnout, those numbers could really make a difference in battleground states like Georgia. And a lot of that, I think, is probably pretty closely related to something that another mutual of mine, Garrison Hayes, who's been a guest on this show, pointed out in a great video that he did on the topic of Black conservatives on YouTube recently. And that is that Black folks as a whole tend to be a lot more socially conservative than their white counterparts. So if Trump is pushing policies that are much more socially conservative, like policies that restrict abortion or LGBTQ rights, that put an emphasis on promoting Christianity within the culture, I think he's likely to pull a bit more support from the Black community overall. And I think a lot of people tend to overlook that fact when considering how Black voters connect and identify with political parties and candidates. So knowing what we do about Trump and how he operates and the fact that he is running against a mixed race woman, it is hardly a surprise that race would be playing the role that it is playing in this election. We know Trump really can't help himself, but I think Kamala Harris is handling this with a lot of discipline and forethought. She's clearly got some good advisors around her as well. I can't imagine that she would not be tempted to spar with him a little bit in this area, especially if it's for the purpose of schooling him on a public stage, because we all know that she could have done just that. But avoiding the bait altogether, as I like to say, avoiding playing the whack-a-mole game, because Trump knows how to play rope-a-dope, avoiding that is very smart on her part. Not allowing him to shift the narrative and shift the focus of this race to the subject of race as a diversionary tactic, not allowing him to take the focus off of the issues is the best strategy. And she can let those of us whose job it is to provide commentary on these things duke it out with the folks that want to play that game. As I said, I hesitate to give a lot of credence to conversations like this unless they can open up the opportunity for us to explore these issues on a deeper level. And that's what I love about being able to do this show weekly with you all. So let's continue this conversation online. Remember to follow the KJLH Instagram page at Radio Free KJLH to make your voice heard. How do you feel that Reagan and Trump's approach to interacting with the Black community differs? Why do you think it is that a significant group of Black folks are putting their full-throated support behind Trump after all that he's done to indicate that he is not really on their side, even after Biden, who has his own sketchy history with race, was replaced by potentially the first Black female president? Why do you think this support for Trump still persists within the Black community? These are the kinds of things that we are working through online, so you can continue to have this conversation with me and a lot of like-minded folks on my Instagram page at Dara Tucker B. On all of my other socials, you can find me at Dara Star Tucker. That's Dara with one R and Star with two. And you can go to vote.org/Dara, D-A-R-A, to check your voter registration. Vote.org/Dara. Get a plan now to vote. Check on your family members and find out if their voter registrations are in order, particularly if they live in a swing state. Figure out now whether you're voting by mail-in ballot, absentee ballot, early voting, day of voting. This is the time to be getting all of that in order. Let's stay vigilant, you all. I'm Dara Star Tucker. Thank you all so much for joining me for this episode of The Breakdown. Be sure to look for the show at the same time in the same place next week. Until then, let's learn to shout.